The house stood at the end of the road like a wounded animal, its once grand walls now cracked and fading, its windows dim and lifeless. The air around it felt heavy, as if the weight of all the cruelty inside had seeped into the very bricks. Within those walls lived Leah Evans, a young woman who had long forgotten what kindness felt like. She was 24, yet her eyes held the weariness of someone twice her age. Each day she woke to the same reality. She was nothing more than a servant in the house that had once been her father's pride. The mornings always began the same way. The sound of her stepmother Margaret's sharp voice slicing through the silence. "Get up, useless girl!" Margaret would shout, her footsteps echoing down the narrow hallway. Leah would pull herself from the thin blanket spread over the cold floor of her tiny room, her body stiff from exhaustion. The floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet as she rushed to the kitchen, where the air smelled of old grease and ashes. She knew better than to speak. Margaret didn't like her voice. She said it reminded her of her father, and that alone was reason enough to silence her. Ethan and Sophie, Margaret's children, waited at the table like royalty, their polished shoes tapping impatiently. "About time," Sophie would sneer, flipping her hair as if Leah's mere presence offended her. Ethan would grin, that cruel smile that always made Leah's stomach twist. "Maybe if you hurry," he'd say, "we won't have to eat cold eggs again." Laughter followed. It was the same every morning, a performance of humiliation that never failed to leave Leah hollow inside. Still she cooked. She scrubbed. She cleaned until her hands bled, her knees bruised from kneeling on hard floors. She did it all in silence because silence was safer. Every mistake came with punishment. A slap, a cruel word, a night without food. Yet what hurt more than the bruises was the emptiness. No one ever said her name with warmth. No one ever asked if she was all right. She existed only to serve, to obey, to endure. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, she would stand by the window of her small room, staring out at the garden that had once been filled with roses. Her father used to plant them every spring, saying they reminded him of her smile. Now they were gone, choked by weeds and neglect. It was as if every trace of his love had been erased from the house. She pressed a trembling hand against the glass and whispered to herself, "There must be more to life than this." It was not hope exactly, but a fragile wish, a whisper against despair. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, the house grew strangely quiet. The usual noise of Margaret's complaints and Ethan's laughter was replaced by a tense hush. Leah noticed the change immediately. She was dusting the hallway when she heard Margaret's low voice drifting from the parlor. "Everything must be perfect tonight," she hissed. "He'll be here soon." Ethan sounded puzzled. "Who?" A pause, then Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "A man with money. More than we've ever seen. If all goes well, we won't have to worry about this worthless girl much longer." Leah froze, her heart pounding. She stepped closer, careful not to make a sound. Through the cracked door, she saw Margaret smoothing her dress in front of the mirror, her lips curling into a greedy smile. "He's coming for a deal," she said. "And if he likes what he sees, our problems will be over." The words sank into Leah like cold water. A deal. What did that mean? She backed away slowly, her breath trembling in her chest. Something inside her whispered that tonight would change everything, but she couldn't tell if it would be for better or far, far worse. The knock on the mansion door came like thunder splitting the air apart. It was late, too late for guests, and Leah felt her heart jolt in her chest. She had just finished scrubbing the kitchen floor, her fingers raw and burning, when Margaret's voice echoed through the house, sharp as a blade. "He's here," she whispered to herself, her lips curling into a greedy smile as she adjusted the pearls around her neck. The air changed the moment the door opened. A tall man stood framed by the darkness outside, the storm wind catching the edge of his coat. Rain glistened in his hair, the faint glow from the chandelier highlighting the sharp lines of his face. He didn't speak at first. His presence was enough to make the room fall silent. Even Ethan and Sophie, usually full of mockery, froze under his cold gaze. "Mr. Stone?" Margaret said, her voice suddenly soft and sweet, dripping with a kind of forced charm that made Leah's stomach twist. "Please come in. We've been expecting you." Victor Stone stepped inside, his shoes echoing on the marble floor. There was power in every movement he made, calm but dangerous, like a storm that hadn't yet broken. His eyes swept the room, and when they finally landed on Leah, She felt her breath catch. It was as if he could see right through her, into the parts of her she had tried to hide all her life. Margaret followed his gaze and forced a laugh. "Oh, don't mind her," she said quickly. "That's just my husband's daughter. She helps around the house." The way she said it made Leia sound like nothing more than a piece of furniture. Victor didn't respond. He kept looking at Leia, his expression unreadable. "How old are you?" he asked at last. His voice was deep, smooth, but there was something in it that made her shiver. 24, she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Margaret cut in before she could say another word. "She's strong, obedient, knows how to keep quiet. Exactly what you wanted, I assume." The words struck Leia like ice water. What you wanted? What did that mean? She looked from Margaret to Victor, her pulse pounding in her ears. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as Margaret's smile widened. "She'll do perfectly." She doesn't talk back. She doesn't question. She'll be no trouble at all. "And the arrangement?" Victor asked. His tone was calm, but his eyes never left Leia's face. "Everything's ready," Margaret said eagerly. "You pay what we agreed, and she's yours to take tonight." Leia's world tilted. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. She shook her head, her hands trembling. "No," she whispered. "No, you can't." Margaret's hand cracked across her face before she could finish. "Don't embarrass me," she hissed. "You should be grateful someone even wants you." Ethan's laughter filled the silence, cruel and sharp. Maybe he'll teach her some manners. But Victor's expression didn't change. If anything, his jaw tightened, his eyes darkening in a way that made even Margaret falter. He pulled a small envelope from his coat and placed it on the table. "You have what you asked for," he said coldly. "Now she comes with me." Margaret grabbed the envelope with shaking hands, greed lighting up her face. "Of course," she said quickly, waving at Leia as if dismissing a servant. "Take her. She's all yours." Leia stumbled back as two men in black suits appeared behind Victor. Their faces were expressionless, their movements deliberate. She tried to run, but one of them caught her arm, firm but not cruel. Her heart raced as tears blurred her vision. "Please," she begged, "don't let them take me." Victor finally spoke again, his gaze steady, voice quiet but unyielding. "No one's hurting you anymore." Margaret laughed, her tone mocking. "She doesn't understand yet," she said. "You'll have to train her to listen." Something flickered in Victor's eyes then. Anger, sharp and cold. He turned to Leia, stepping closer until she could see her own reflection in his gaze. "You'll come with me," he said, his tone soft but absolute. "Your life here ends tonight." Before Leia could respond, the men guided her toward the door. She looked over her shoulder one last time, seeing Margaret's satisfied smirk, Ethan's grin, Sophie's whisper of amusement, and then the door closed behind her, sealing her fate. Outside, the rain poured harder. Victor opened the car door and gestured for her to get in. She hesitated, her heart still pounding with fear. He leaned closer, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Whatever you think is happening, it's not what it seems. You're safe now, even if you don't believe it yet." Leia sat in silence as the car began to move, her mind spinning with confusion and dread. Behind her, the mansion faded into the darkness, and ahead of her, the unknown awaited. She didn't know if she had escaped a nightmare or stepped into another one. The car moved through the storm like a shadow cutting across the night. Rain beat against the windows in wild rhythm while lightning flashed over the road, lighting Victor's face for just a second at a time. He sat completely still, his hands resting on his knees, his sharp eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Every inch of him radiated power, control, and something deeper that Leia couldn't understand. She sat on the far side of the seat, her wet hands gripping the edge of her torn dress, her heart still pounding from what had just happened. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the engine and the rain whispering against the car. Every time she glanced at him, she felt her chest tighten. Who was this man? Why had he bought her? Her mind kept repeating the same words Margaret had said. "She's all yours." The thought made her throat burn. Finally, she found the courage to speak, her voice trembling. "Why did you take me?" she asked, staring out the window, afraid to look at him. "What do you want from me?" Victor didn't answer immediately. His gaze stayed fixed on the road, but there was something in the air around him, a tension that made the space between them feel too small. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, but cold. "You'll know soon enough." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but there was no cruelty in it. Still, her fear grew. Her whole life she had been treated like a burden, an object. What if this was the same? What if she had traded one prison for another? She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching raindrops race each other down the window. She didn't cry. She refused to. Victor glanced at her reflection in the glass. She looked fragile, but there was a spark in her eyes, something unbroken. That spark caught him off guard. He had seen people beg, bargain, break, but not her. She was terrified, yet she held herself with quiet strength. It stirred something inside him that he didn't like to name. After what felt like an eternity, the car turned off the main road and began to climb a long, winding path through dense woods. The storm followed them, wind howling through the trees, lightning flashing against the clouds. Ahead, faint lights appeared in the distance. When they finally stopped, Leia gasped softly. The mansion before them rose like something out of a dream, massive stone pillars, glass windows glimmering with gold light, and a gate that opened automatically as if bowing to its master. She had never seen anything so grand, but instead of awe, she felt dread. The place was too quiet, too perfect, as if it was hiding secrets in its walls. The driver opened her door. Leia hesitated, her body frozen. Victor stepped out first and turned to face her. The wind blew his coat behind him, rain running down his jaw. His voice cut through the storm, low and steady. "You can stay here without fear. No one will touch you again." She didn't move. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why would you care?" His eyes softened for a moment, but only for a heartbeat. "Because I know what it's like to be trapped," he said. Then he turned toward the mansion, expecting her to follow. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wave. Everything gleamed: polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the faint scent of roses and wood. It was beautiful, but she felt out of place, a ghost among perfection. She followed him silently up the staircase until they reached a hallway lined with tall doors. Victor stopped in front of one and opened it. The room beyond took her breath away. A massive bed draped in velvet, silk curtains flowing like clouds, a fire flickering in the corner. It was too much, too strange. "This is your room," Victor said quietly. "You will rest here. Clothes, food, anything you need. It's yours." She turned to him, confused and trembling. "What am I to you?" she asked, her voice breaking. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then he stepped closer, his words slow, deliberate. "You're someone who's going to learn what peace feels like." Before she could respond, he turned and walked out. The door closing behind him with a soft click, Leia stood in the center of the room, her heart racing, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't answer. She didn't know if she was safe. She didn't know if she should trust him. But for the first time in years, no one was shouting at her. No one was hurting her. Outside, the storm began to fade, leaving behind the faint sound of the ocean in the distance. Leia sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers gripping the blanket. She wanted to believe him, but deep down she knew. Men like Victor Stone didn't save people for no reason. There was always a price. And whatever it was, she would soon find out. The sun was just beginning to rise when Leia opened her eyes the next morning. The golden light spilling across the silk sheets felt unreal for a moment. She forgot where she was. The warmth, the quiet, the softness of the pillow beneath her head. All of it was so far from the cold, hard floor she had slept on her entire life. But then the memories came flooding back. The storm. The car. The man with eyes like steel and fire, Victor Stone. She sat up slowly, her bare feet touching the cool marble floor. The room was silent, except for the gentle crackle of the fireplace. Everything looked untouched, as if no one dared disturb the peace here. A tray of breakfast sat near the window. Untouched, still warm. She stared at it, unsure if it was meant. For her back home, she was never allowed to eat before the others, always after. Always the leftover, her stomach twisted with hunger, but her hands trembled too much to move. She didn't know the rules here. Not yet. What if taking a single bite without permission meant punishment again? Her heart raced. Just thinking about it. The sound of a door opening made her freeze. Victor stepped into the room wearing a black shirt, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. His presence filled the space effortlessly, powerful, controlled, but different. Somehow softer than last night. His gaze went straight to her eyes, sharp but unreadable. "You didn't eat." He said, his tone calm but firm. It wasn't a question. She shook her head quickly, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know if I was allowed." His expression darkened as if something about that sentence hurt him. He stepped closer, stopping just in front of her, his height casting a long shadow across the bed. "You don't need permission to eat here, Leia. Not anymore." She looked up at him. Uncertain confusion and fear tangled together inside her. She wanted to ask why he cared, why he spoke her name like it meant something. But the words stayed trapped in her throat. He gestured to the tray. "Eat you need? Strength." She hesitated, then finally picked up a piece of bread, her fingers shaking as she brought it to her lips. He didn't move. He simply watched her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. She expected to feel judged, but instead she saw something she had never seen in any man's eyes before. Concern, real concern. When she finished, he said quietly, "Come with me. I want to show you something." He led her through the mansion's long corridors lined with art and polished glass. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and rain. When they reached a pair of tall wooden doors, Victor pushed them open, revealing a private garden bathed in morning light. It was breathtaking. The flowers glistened with dew, the air alive with birdsong. "This is yours?" he said simply. She blinked, confused. "Mine. Yes, everything you see, everything you touch is yours now." Tears stung her eyes. She turned to him, shaking her head. "I don't understand. Why would you do this for me?" "I'm no one." He stepped closer, until she could feel the warmth of his breath. "You are someone, Leia. You're someone who deserves to breathe without fear. Someone who deserves to be free for a moment." Neither of them moved, the air between them, heavy with something unspoken. Something that made her heart flutter in her chest. He reached out his hand but stopped just short of touching her, as if afraid she might vanish. "If he did, there are things about me you don't know yet," he said, his voice lower now. "Darker things. But I promise you this. You will never be hurt again." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't know if it was fear or something else. But when she met his eyes, she saw a truth there that made her believe him, even if just for a moment. Later that night, as the house grew quiet and the world outside sank into darkness, Leia stood by the window of her new room, staring at the distant lights of the city. She could still hear his words echoing in her mind. "You are someone who deserves to be free." She wanted to believe that. But deep down, a question still haunted her. What kind of man saves a stranger from cruelty and gives her a kingdom in return? And what would he want in exchange when the time came to collect his debt? Night had fallen heavy and silent over the mansion, when Leia woke to the faint sound of voices somewhere beyond her door. Her heart thudded fast against her chest. At first she thought it was another dream, one of those old nightmares where Margaret's laughter echoed through the dark. But this was different. The voices were deeper. Tense-controlled one of them belonged to Victor. She slipped from the bed, careful not to make a sound. The soft rug muffled her steps as she crept closer to the half. Open door the corridor outside was dimly lit shadows stretching long across the marble floor. She leaned forward, holding her breath in. The grand hall below. Victor stood near the fireplace, his back to her, his voice low and sharp, his tone carried a power that could freeze the air. Two men dressed in black stood across from him. One of them said quietly, "We found them. Sir Margaret Ethan and Sophie. They've been trying to sell her father's estate. Papers. Falsified documents." Victor's jaw tightened, his next words like a blade. "I want every trace of their name erased, every debt they owe, every lie they've sold. I want it all destroyed." The men nodded, one asked, and the girl lay. "Does she know any of this?" Victor hesitated just long, enough for Leia's stomach to twist. "She shouldn't know. Not yet," he said. Finally. "She's not ready to hear what they did to her father. Not ready to learn how deep this goes." Leia's breath caught her hand, flew to her mouth they had spoken about. Her father for the first time in years. And what did he mean? What had they done to him? She backed away from the door, her heart racing too fast. The edges of the world blurred. She needed answers, but before she could move, Victor's voice carried, again colder now. "Make sure the press doesn't hear about this. If anyone tries to protect them, I'll ruin them too." His words echoed like thunder in her chest. She had seen cruelty before, but this was something else. Controlled, measured, terrifying. She turned away and slipped back into her room, closing the door with shaking hands. Her mind spinning. Victor was helping her. Yes, but why? Why go this far? The next morning. The mansion was quiet again. Too quiet when she stepped into the hallway. One of the maids paused, bowing quickly. "Good morning, Miss Leia. Breakfast is ready downstairs." But Mr. Stone said not to disturb him until later. She nodded, distracted, her mind still tangled in the memory of his voice from the night before. She needed to see him? She needed to understand. When she finally found him in his study, he was sitting behind a massive oak desk, his eyes fixed on a laptop screen, papers scattered around him. He looked up when she entered his gaze, unreadable but softer than before. "You're awake earlier than usual." She swallowed, trying to steady her voice. "I heard you last night. You were talking about my family." His body went still. His jaw flexed, and for the first time she saw something flicker in his expression. Not anger, but regret. They destroyed everything. He said quietly, after a long pause, "Your father's company, his accounts, his reputation. Margaret forged his name and sold it all. She took what belonged to you and left nothing but debt and ruin when he tried to fight back. He was poisoned by his own partner." Her breath hitched. Poisoned, but Victor kept talking. His tone steady as steel. "They called it a heart attack. The police never looked deeper. I did." The room spun around her. She gripped the edge of the desk, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve the truth," he said. "And because they're still out there." Tears burned her eyes. She shook her head, struggling to process it all. "All this time. I thought it was just cruelty. I didn't know she killed him." Victor stood and came around the desk, his movements calm but purposeful. He stopped inches from her, his eyes locking onto hers. "I promised you no one would ever hurt you again. That wasn't a kindness, Leia. It was a vow, and I intend to keep it." The air between them felt electric. His nearness overwhelming her with confusion, fear, and something deeper. Something she didn't dare name yet. He reached up, brushing a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb, his voice soft now, almost fragile. "You've suffered enough. Let me carry the rest." Her breath trembled, she wanted to pull away. But instead she whispered, "What are you going to do to them?" He didn't hesitate everything as he turned back toward his desk. She realized that whatever Victor Stone planned, it wasn't mercy. It was vengeance. And somewhere deep inside her, she felt the first spark of terror. Not for herself, but for the people who had made her suffer. Because she knew he meant every word. And when Victor Stone decided to destroy someone, there was no saving them. The wind howled outside the mansion that night, a storm building far beyond the sea, as if the world itself was preparing for what was coming. The air inside was tense, heavy alive with something she couldn't quite name. Leia sat by the fireplace staring into the flames, trying to calm the storm inside her chest. Victor had told her everything about her father, about Margaret's lies, the poison, the theft, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more hidden beneath the surface. Something he hadn't said, something darker. The door opened suddenly, and Victor stepped in. Rain glistening in his hair, his black coat dripping onto the marble floor. He looked different tonight. Not like the composed man who ruled empires, but like someone fighting a battle. No one else could see. His eyes met hers, and the silence that followed was electric. "You couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, rough. She shook her head quietly. "There's too much in my mind." He walked closer each step, deliberate until the firelight caught the hard lines of his face. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze unreadable. "I know what it's like," he said softly, "when truth feels heavier than the lies that once trapped you." His words hit something deep inside her. She turned her eyes to the fire, the light flickering across her face. "I don't know how to live now," she whispered. "I've spent my life being afraid, obeying, people who hated me, and now you've given me all this freedom. But I don't even know who I am anymore." Victor moved closer, kneeling beside her. The warmth from the fire brushed his face when he spoke. His voice carried something she had never heard from him before: gentleness. "You are who you choose to be, Leia, not what they made you." His hand brushed lightly against her wrist and she froze. The touch wasn't demanding. It wasn't possessive. It was steady, grounding his fingers rough with strength, yet careful as if she were something precious. He feared to break. The thunder outside rumbled closer. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating his face for a split second. She saw something in his eyes, a storm that matched her own suddenly. A sharp crack echoed from somewhere deep within the mansion. A door slammed. Then footsteps fast, heavy, moving through the hall. Victor stood instantly, his entire body shifting from gentle to alert. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice firm again. Before she could speak, he was gone, moving down the corridor with the speed of a man used to danger. Leia's heart pounded in her chest. She rose to her feet and followed quietly. Despite his warning, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. The sound came from the main hall. She hid behind one of the pillars and peered around the corner. 3 men stood inside, soaked from the rain, their clothes dark and their faces hidden under hoods. They weren't guards. These were strangers, intruders. Victor faced them alone, his expression carved from stone. "You picked the wrong house," he said calmly, his tone like ice. The tallest man stepped forward, his voice mocking. "We're only here for what's owed to us. You took something that doesn't belong to you." The girl Leia's stomach dropped. She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting the urge to gasp. They had come for her. Victor's shoulders stiffened, his eyes burning with fury. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he said coldly. "And you'll regret stepping foot on my land." What happened next was a blur. One man lunged. Victor moved faster than she thought possible, grabbing his arm and twisting it until a sickening crack filled the air. The others tried to rush him, but his guards appeared from the shadows, guns raised. Chaos exploded through the hall, the sound of shouts and broken glass echoing like thunder. When it was over, the intruders were on the ground, restrained, The guards dragged them away as Victor stood over them, breathing hard. Rain still. Dripping from his coat, he turned his head toward the pillar where she hid, and for a moment their eyes met across the chaos. She stepped out slowly, her voice trembling. Victor, who were they? He looked at her, the firelight from the hall dancing across. His face, his voice low, dangerous. They were sent by Margaret. She isn't finished yet. The words hit her like a blow. She staggered back, shaking. She couldn't understand how hatred could reach this far. Victor crossed the distance between them, catching her shoulders gently. She's trying to make me give you up, but she doesn't understand something. Vital. What she whispered, barely breathing. He leaned closer. His voice soft but fierce. I would burn the world before I let anyone take you from me. For the first time since she met him, she didn't doubt his words. The storm outside raged louder, lightning flashing across the sky. But inside the fire burned stronger, casting their shadows together on the wall. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew this night had changed everything forever. The next morning, the mansion stood silent. But something in the air had changed. The storm had passed outside. Yet inside another one was quietly growing. Leia woke to the faint sound of distant voices and the low hum of engines somewhere beyond. The window. The sun cut through the curtains, golden and soft, but her chest felt heavy. She remembered the intruders. Their words, their threat, and Victor's promise. When she stepped out of her room, she found the hall unusually crowded. Guards in black moved quickly, speaking in low tones. They carried files, radios, weapons. There was tension in their movements, controlled but fierce. Something big was happening. Victor stood at the center of it all, his sharp eyes scanning a digital map on the screen. Before him, he looked different, colder, harder. His jaw set like iron when he noticed her watching. He turned slightly, his voice steady. You should be resting. She shook her head. I couldn't sleep. What's going on? He hesitated for a moment, then said, quietly, Your stepmother is trying to escape the city. We found proof she's been selling information to people who want me dead. Her heart stopped. She whispered in disbelief. She's working with them. Yes, he said calmly, but underneath the calm was fury. She took money from men who would have used you for far worse things than servitude. When I bought you that night, I wasn't buying you, Leia. I was saving you from them. The truth hit her like lightning. Everything began to make sense. The deal, the secrecy, the fear. Margaret had not sold her out of greed alone. She had sold her to monsters, and Victor had intervened before it was too late. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. Because you weren't ready? His tone softened, his eyes meeting hers. You needed to believe you were safe before I told you how close you came to being destroyed. She stared at him, her throat tight. She didn't know if she wanted to cry or scream, but all she could manage was a whisper. What are you going to do to? Harry looked away, his gaze dark. I'm going to end it that night. He left the mansion with 4 black cars moving like shadows into the distance. The silence that followed was unbearable. Leia waited by the window, her fingers gripping the curtains, each passing hour stretching into eternity. The fear inside her grew not for Margaret, but for him at midnight. The door burst open. The guards rushed in, faces pale. Miss Leia. One of them said, breathless, You need to come downstairs, no. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she ran through the corridor, her bare feet slapping against the marble floor when she reached the grand entrance. The scene before her made her stop. Cold Victor stood there, soaked in rain blood on his sleeve, his coat torn, his expression unreadable behind him. 2 guards dragged a figure inside, bound and trembling. Margaret. Leia froze, every muscle in her body tightening. The woman who had ruined her life now stood before her, broken, dirty, her eyes wide with fear. Victor's voice was quiet, but carried through the hall. She tried to flee. She called the same men who came last night. She wanted to trade your location for money. Margaret's. Voice cracked, desperate. Please, Victor, please, I didn't mean to. She turned toward Leia, her voice shaking. Tell him, Leia. Tell him I'm your family. I raised you. The words made Leia's blood boil. Raised her. She said softly, You destroyed me. The air in the room shifted. Victor turned to her, his tone low. This is your choice, Leia. What happens to her is in your hands. She looked at Margaret, trembling on the floor, then at Victor, his gaze unwavering. She had dreamed of this moment so many times, of seeing her tormentor helpless, begging for mercy. But now that it was here, she felt only emptiness. Finally, she whispered, I don't want revenge. I just want her gone far away, where she can never touch me again. Victor's jaw tightened, but he nodded as you wish. Then he turned to his men. Make sure she disappears and never finds her. Way back. Margaret screamed as they dragged her out. But Leia didn't flinch. She stood still, her hands trembling, tears falling silently down her face when the doors closed. Victor stepped toward her, his voice softer now. You did the right thing, she shook her head. No, I did the only thing that wouldn't destroy me. He reached out, pulling her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She let herself sink into him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her ear. The world outside could fall apart, but here in his arms, she felt unshakably safe as the night deepened. He whispered against her hair, It's over now. No one will ever hurt you again. But somewhere far away, deep in the darkness, a man watched the scene unfold. Through a glowing screen, his lips curling into a slow smile. The girl is still alive, he murmured, then leaned back in his chair. We'll finish what Margaret couldn't. The storm was not over. Not yet. The days that followed felt like a strange calm. After a hurricane, the mansion was quiet. The danger seemed to have passed. But deep inside Leia's heart, there was still a faint tremor, like an echo that refused to fade. Victor had not spoken much since the night Margaret was taken away. He spent long hours in his office, his guards coming and going with grim faces. Something was happening behind those doors, something he was keeping from her. Leia tried to fill her days with small things. She explored the gardens she painted in the sunlight. She even began to laugh again. But whenever the wind shifted or footsteps echoed in the corridor, she found herself tensing, waiting for a voice, a shadow, a threat. The peace felt fragile, too perfect to be real. Evening, she stood by the window watching. The last light fade from the sky when she saw it. A car parked at the edge of the property just beyond the gates. It didn't move. It just sat there, silent, its headlights off. Her breath caught. She turned quickly, running through the hall. Victor, she called, but before she reached his office, the door opened from the inside. He was already there, his expression dark. I saw, he said quietly. So it's real, she whispered. They're watching us. He nodded, his jaw clenched. I warned them once they didn't. Listen. His voice carried the kind of cold fury that made her blood run cold. He turned to one of his men standing by the door. Tighten security. No one comes in or out without my word. The man left immediately, the air in the room thick with tension. Victor turned to Leia, his eyes softening when he saw her fear. You're safe here, Leia, I promise. She shook her head. How can you be sure? He paused, then said, Because I've been hunted before, and I learned how to survive. She wanted to ask him what that meant, but he stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder, his touch steady. Trust me, he said, and for a moment she did. That night she woke to the sound of thunder, but this time it wasn't the weather. It was an explosion, distant, but powerful. The windows rattled, the lights flickered, and alarms echoed through the mansion. She jumped from the bed, her heart slamming in her chest. Outside the door, guards were shouting orders. Victor's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Get her out. Now, 2 men appeared at her door. One grabbed her hand. Miss Leia, we have to move. She tried to resist. I'm not leaving without him, but they didn't slow pulling her down the corridor. Smoke filled the air, the smell of burning wood sharp and suffocating. When they reached the lower hall, flames were already crawling up the walls. Someone had breached the perimeter. The guards opened the back door, leading her toward a black car waiting in the courtyard. She turned one last time and saw Victor standing. In the center of the chaos, giving orders calm, even as firelight glowed behind him, he caught her eyes across the distance and shouted. Tears blurred her vision as the car sped away. The mansion shrinking in the rear window, flames flickering like ghosts in the night. Her voice trembled. He's still inside, the guard beside her shook his head. He's buying us time. When the car finally stopped, they were at a remote house near the cliffs. The air smelled of salt and rain. Leia stumbled out still. Shaking, the guard handed her a small phone, his voice low. He told me to give you this, only if we were separated. She took it, pressing it to her chest as if it might hold him inside. An hour later, the screen lit up with a message from Victor 3. Words, I'm coming back. She sank to her knees, clutching the phone, whispering, Please be safe. Please come back. Miles away. Victor stood in the ruins of his home, the fire dying behind him, his face streaked with ash. One of his men approached the report. Was grim. They know her name now, they'll come for her. He nodded, his expression unreadable, then spoke quietly. Let them come. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon. Leia stood by the cliff wind, whipping through her hair, the sea roaring. Below, and somewhere far behind her in the shadows, a pair of eyes watched her. Every move, the hunter had found his prey again. The morning came cloaked in fog and silence. The sea outside, the cliff house moved like gray glass, and the air carried a chill that crept beneath Leia's skin. She hadn't slept at all. Victor's last message still echoed in her mind. I'm coming. Back, but hours had passed, and he hadn't returned. Every sound outside, every whisper of wind made her flinch. She stood by the window, watching the mist roll over the horizon. When suddenly the phone buzzed again. Her breath caught. She snatched it from the table, but the message on the screen wasn't from Victor. It was an unknown number. The words were simple and terrifying. He won't make it. Their heart froze. She read it again and again, hoping she had imagined it. Then the phone rang, the same number flashing on the screen. She hesitated before answering. A voice came through, distorted and calm. You thought he could protect you, but now he's gone. The line went dead. She dropped the phone, her legs shaking. Tears filled her eyes, but she forced herself to move. She ran to the door, pulling it open, only to find one of Victor's guards already there, his face pale. Miss Leia, we lost contact with Mr. Stone's convoy. His car was ambushed 3 miles from the mansion. The words hit her like a physical blow. No, she whispered. No, that can't be true. But the guard's silence told her everything. Her knees gave out and she sank to the floor, the world spinning around her. Hours passed. She didn't remember how she ended up in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the flames, her hands still trembling. The guards moved around her, whispering orders, tightening security. But she felt miles away, trapped inside a storm of fear and grief. Then footsteps echoed outside, heavy, deliberate. Not the rushed rhythm of guards, but something colder. She turned toward the door. It creaked open, slowly revealing a man she didn't recognize. Tall, dressed in black, his face half hidden by shadows, his voice smooth as ice. You must be Leia Evans. The guards drew their weapons, but the man only smiled. I wouldn't do that if I were you, he said calmly. I came to deliver a message from the people who owned Margaret. He stepped closer, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. Victor Stone took something that belonged to us. Now we're here to take it back. before she could react. Chaos. Erupted gunfire shattered. The silence shouts filled the air. She dropped to the floor, covering her head as the sound of bullets tore through the room. Smoke filled. Her lungs, someone grabbed her arm, rough and strong, dragging her toward the back exit. She struggled, screaming Victor's name, but her voice was lost in the noise. When she woke again, everything was dark. Her head throbbed, her wrists tied behind her. The smell of oil and dust filled her nose. She was in a warehouse lit by a single flickering bulb. A group of men stood near the door, whispering. One of them noticed her awake and smirked. "So you're the girl he risked everything for." She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. The man crouched in front of her, his eyes cold. "Victor Stone thinks he can play God," he said. "But even gods bleed." She stared at him, fear clawing at her chest. "Where is he?" she whispered. He laughed somewhere between life and death. Before he could say more, the sound of engines echoed outside. Loud, fast headlights flashed through the cracks in the walls. The men grabbed their guns, panic rippling through them. One shouted, "He's here!" The door exploded inward, the force. Shaking the floor and through the smoke, Victor appeared alive. His face cut, his eyes burning with fury. He moved like a shadow, his voice low and deadly. "You made one mistake touching what's mine." Gunfire erupted, chaos filled the room, but all Leia could see was him. Every movement precise. Every shot echoing with purpose. When it was over, silence fell, broken only by the sound of her breathing. He dropped his weapon and crossed the floor to her, his hands shaking as he untied the ropes, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told you I'd come back." She stared at him, tears blurring her vision. "You could have died." He smiled faintly. "I almost did. But then I remembered your face, and I couldn't stop fighting." She collapsed into his arms, sobbing. Against his chest, the warehouse around them still thick with smoke. The danger not yet gone, but for that moment, time stood still. They had survived again together. Outside, the night was still alive with sirens and fire. But Victor didn't look back. He carried her to the car, whispering close to her ear. "I'm never letting them take you again, even if it means burning the world to ashes." The night they escaped the warehouse, the world seemed to blur into smoke and silence. Victor drove without a word, his knuckles white around the wheel, his face pale under the streaks of blood and dust. Leia sat beside him, shaking her hands pressed to her chest. She wanted to speak, but her voice wouldn't come every time she closed her eyes. She saw flashes of the chaos, the gunfire, the moment she thought she had lost him forever. When the car finally stopped, they were miles away in the mountains, the air cold and sharp, the road empty for miles. Victor stepped out, first scanning the darkness around them, then turned to her, his voice low. "We're safe for now." She climbed out of the car, her body weak, but her mind burning with questions. She looked at him in the faint glow of the headlights. "You could have died for me," she whispered. "Why would you do?" But he stared at her for a long moment. Rain starting to fall again. Soft and steady, because he said quietly, "You're the only thing left in this world that makes me want to live." The words hit her harder than the storm. He looked exhausted and broken, yet his eyes carried a truth that left her breathless. She wanted to run to him, to hold him, but something in his expression stopped her. There was still more behind that calm mask. Something he hadn't said yet. They took shelter in a small cabin, hidden in the woods. Victor moved through the dark lighting candles, checking the windows. Every sound outside made him tense. She could see how deep the battle had scarred him. His shoulder was bleeding, his movements slower, but he said nothing about it. Finally, she grabbed his arm, forcing him to sit. "You're hurt." He tried to brush it off. "It's nothing." She glared at him, angry and terrified. "Stop pretending you don't feel pain. You're not made of stone." Victor. For a second, he just stared at her. Then, his voice cracked soft and low. I'm not, but I had to be to survive the things I've done to protect you. The people I've destroyed. You don't know half of it. She reached out gently, touching his face. Then tell me the truth. I want to know all of it. His eyes darkened, but he didn't pull away when I found out what Margaret was planning. I learned she wasn't working alone. There's a man named Vance. He runs a network built on selling lives. Yours was meant to be one of them. I took everything from him. His money, his connections, his freedom. But he escaped the warehouse tonight wasn't about you, Leia. It was about him coming back for revenge. She felt the blood drain from her face. So he's still out there. Victor nodded. And he won't stop until he's dead. Or I am a sudden crash outside made them both freeze. The sound of footsteps crunching on wet leaves. Victor moved instantly, his gun in hand. Stay behind me, he whispered. She obeyed, her heart pounding the door, creaked. The shadows moved, and then a figure stepped inside. It was Vance. His face half burned from the explosion. His smile twisted. You should have finished the job. Victor. The two men faced each other, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself stopped moving. Vance raised his gun. Victor didn't flinch instead. He said coldly, You made one mistake coming here. She's not yours and she never will be. The gun fired once, the sound splitting the night. Leia screamed, but when the smoke cleared, it was Vance who fell. Victor stood still, breathing hard, his hand trembling around the gun. He looked down at the man on the floor, his voice barely a whisper. It's over. He dropped the weapon, his shoulders shaking. Leia ran to him, throwing her arms. Around him he held her tight, burying his face in her hair, whispering over and over, It's over. You're safe now, you're safe. The storm outside began to fade, leaving only the sound of rain against the roof. The dawn crept slowly across the horizon, painting the sky in soft gold and blue. They sat by the fire, Victor's head resting against her shoulder, his voice quiet. I don't deserve peace, but maybe with you I can learn how. She smiled through her tears. Taking his hand, You already have months. Later, the mansion was rebuilt brighter and filled with life again. Leia's paintings hung on the walls. The garden bloomed with roses. Just like her father once planted, children from the village played there every day. Part of the charity she and Victor had started together, a home for those with nowhere else to go, on the anniversary of the night he saved her. Victor took her hand and led her to the same garden where their story had begun. He knelt before her, his voice soft but sure. You were never something I owned. You were the reason I changed. You're my heart, my home. My forever. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, And you're mine. The wind moved through the roses, carrying the scent of peace across the air. The ghosts of the past, finally fading behind them, and as the sun rose over the golden mansion on the hill, Leia knew the nightmare was over, because love had not just saved them. It had redeemed them both forever.